We have now stringent observations which provide us a robust picture of a warming climate, of a warming planet in almost all regions.
Without some kind of price on greenhouse gas emissions, markets are giving the wrong signals. They're failing, and indeed I did once describe it, I think perfectly reasonably, as the greatest market failure the world has ever seen.
No, there's no need to bother about capping emissions, and it is not going to happen. I give you a prediction that it will not happen.
In June 2009, 7,000 delegates from around the world gathered in Bonn to try to agree a negotiating text for what has been billed the most important meeting for the future of the planet, the Copenhagen Climate Summit, taking place in December. The world's leaders face a simple question. In order to avoid the worst impact of climate change, how deeply are they prepared to cut CO2 emissions? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group comprising 2,500 of the world's top climatologists, has concluded that human activity has pushed atmospheric CO2 to dangerously high levels. Scientists have outlined how animal and plant life would be severely affected, but the consequences for the global economy have been less well understood. Many dire economic predictions had been made, but it took Lord Nicholas Stern, a dispassionate and unassuming ex-British Treasury and World Bank economist, to get science and economics on the same page. The Stern Report of 2006, commissioned by the Tony Blair government, was the first to put a price on failing to tackle the causes of a warming planet.
This is the most important report on the future published by this government in its time in office.
According to Stern, 2% of world GDP needs to be spent on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Failure to act now, says Stern, means that in 50 years' time, we could be faced with bills 10 times that amount and runaway climate change. This time on Naturing, we examine the economic cost of climate change. We report on a country that has taken renewable energy seriously while maintaining growth, and discover that nature is having the biggest economic impact of all on climate.
If we fail to manage climate change, we will see by the end of this century or the beginning of next probably temperatures of 4, 5, 6 degrees centigrade. That would involve huge disruption in the physical geography of the world. Some areas would turn into deserts. Other areas will be flooded. Other areas would be battered by hurricanes. Some rivers would see their courses change. Sea levels would rise, coastlines would change.
Nicholas Stern's warning is stark, and his economic analysis is straightforward. Without early action on climate change, we risk paying a much higher price not so very far down the road. And some of the cost is likely to fall on developing countries, which are least able to pay.
The UNDP has done a very useful calculation where it argued that the costs to developing countries of trying to meet their development goals would be around 85 billion per annum dollars, compared with what might have been the cost if the climate had stayed more stable.
Stern estimates a single tonne of CO2 going into the atmosphere causes damages worth at least $85. There are 70 million tonnes going up each day, and no one is paying the price. Stern argues that market forces have been skewed.
When we deprive other people of labour because it's used to make a shirt, we pay for it and we think that's normal, and it's right, because what the market is doing is giving an indication of scarcity. It's giving an indication of the cost of production, and markets should reflect the cost of producing something. Without some kind of price on greenhouse gas emissions, markets are giving the wrong signals. They're failing, and indeed I did once describe it, I think perfectly reasonably, as the greatest market failure the world has ever seen.
Stern argues that this market failure is best reversed by taxing emissions.
We don't give up markets because of market failure. Markets are very important. The challenge then is to get them to work well. So that means a price for greenhouse gases. How much would that price or tax on carbon be? It might be 50, perhaps a bit more, dollars a tonne of CO2. How would that translate into increases in prices of gasoline? It might involve something like 40 US cents a gallon. It's a significant cost, but it's the kind of cost that we should be able to adjust to.
And Stern sees potential benefits. Taxation, together with energy efficiency measures and new technologies, could shift the world onto a low-carbon path. He estimates this could eventually boost the world economy by $2.5 trillion a year. However, not everyone agrees with Stern's figures. Nigel Lawson, Finance Minister under Margaret Thatcher, is one such person.
The great majority of the economics profession have come out and said that his economics, the economics of the Stern Review, is plain wrong.
Critics argue that Stern overestimates the real costs of dealing with climate change. Rather than paying to reduce emissions now, it may be more cost-effective to pay for adaptation to the effects of climate change, as and when they arise.
We adapt to it. That's what people do. That's what people always have done. That's much more cost-effective. And for the poorest countries of the world who can't afford the adaptation, you give them overseas aid to enable them to adapt. And that is perfectly plausible, perfectly sensible.
Stern agrees adaptation does have value.
We will have to adapt to climate change, and we'll have to adapt more if there's more climate change, and we can influence through our actions, through our emissions, how much climate change there will be. So in looking at those kinds of decisions, how much to cut back, how much to spend on adaptation, one has to take a view on what are the risks that you're avoiding in terms of the economics of those risks.
Decisions on how much money should be spent to avert climate change will be central to the climate meeting taking place in Denmark's capital, Copenhagen, this December. One long-held view is that any country moving to a low-carbon economy will lose out to other countries who continue their fossil fuel guzzling ways. To test this, Nature Inc. went to the country that will be host to the conference to find out if policies brazenly favouring non-polluting energy had held back the economy. Connie Hedegaard is Denmark's Minister for Climate and Energy. She's in no doubt that Denmark's policies have helped rather than hindered the economy.
We focused for 30 years on energy efficiency and on renewables. And there is a huge public support for a number of reasons. One of them being that it's creating a lot of jobs. So actually today, renewable and energy efficient technologies will be one of our fastest growing export areas.
When the 1970s oil crisis struck, Denmark was 99% dependent on oil from the Middle East for all its energy needs. Today, almost 4 decades later, Denmark is the only EU nation to be energy self-sufficient. And it's not all down to North Sea oil either. Denmark has the highest proportion of electricity generation produced from renewable sources in Europe, almost 30%. And it's wind power that's responsible for the lion's share. The boom in wind has brought jobs too, over 20,000. Almost half of all the wind turbines in the world are manufactured by Danish companies. Public support has been critical. It has to be. The Danes have among the world's highest taxes. But the high tax base has enabled successive governments since 1973 to provide the financial backing to help develop renewable energy technologies.
It has been heavily subsidized over the years, and really I think there's common acknowledgement today that the reason we have such a strong industry today simply is that the government intervened at the time.
It's not sort of a partisan issue, it's across party lines.
On the Danish island of the island's 4,000 plus population have gone one step further. Here, all the islanders' electricity and heating comes from renewable energy. Even the cars and tractors are now being modified to use rapeseed oil for fuel. And it's good in salads too. The project cost the islanders €54 million, with €4 million in public subsidies. The key to making this work lay in involving the whole community.
You cannot do it without them. You need to be attached to, for example, wind turbines. They have to be there for a reason, and if they are not, people will object to them and say, why do they disturb my view?
The islanders are now shareholders in the renewable energy business, so they get paid when excess power is sold back to the mainland.
Some are directly investors and some are a part of a community project. And every person on this island is having a profit from this investment. Some are big investors and some are smaller investors, but everybody is gaining from this project.
Although the Danes have the largest proportion of electricity generation by wind in the world, as a country they still emit 9.8 metric tonnes of CO2 per person per year. So even though Danish renewable power generation has a long way to go before Denmark can claim to be a bona fide low-carbon economy, wind power alone does provide electricity for 1.4 million homes. That is the whole of Western Denmark. Emerging economies at various stages of development are also making significant commitments. In June, China announced plans to produce a fifth of its energy needs from renewable sources by 2020 and earmarked $30 billion for low-carbon projects. Korea plans to supply 100,000 homes using solar power by 2012, almost a tenfold increase over 2007.
Isn't it amazing that we right now are experiencing the biggest economic crisis for decades and still climate is on the agenda? What does that mean? That people have realized that we cannot solve the economic crisis unless we also solve the question of where is our energy going to come from and how are we going to solve the climate crisis.
Our oceans, forests and peatlands act as sponges for carbon. Scientists call the process biosequestration. But they are getting alarmed that at the very time we should be taking steps to safeguard our no-cost CO2 sequesters, we are damaging them, in some cases beyond repair. The forests and oceans are the world's biggest carbon sinks. They absorb around a half of CO2 emissions produced by humans. But the global economy is clearing the forests and overburdening the seas. These scientists in Svalbard, an island archipelago deep inside the Arctic Circle, are analysing the impact of increased CO2 levels in the water. Too much can lead to ocean acidification.
One of the things we're looking at in this mess is, of course, the production or the sequestration of carbon, and this is carbon mostly.
As the water soaks up some of the extra CO2 from the atmosphere, so the chemical nature of the water changes from alkaline to acid. The effects could be disastrous. Under acidic conditions, shellfish and crabs are denied calcium to build their shells, and coral reefs die. Scientists debating rising CO2 levels recognise ocean acidification as potentially one of the most serious but least understood environmental impact.
I'm very concerned about the risk of ocean acidification. In 30 years' time, you will not be looking at an ocean that is healthy because of CO2. Your kids will go down to the sea and see a sea in which coral reefs are no longer growing and in which reefs are beginning to dissolve.
The impact on the world's fisheries could be immense. 520 million people are dependent on the fishing industry for their livelihood. Nearly 3 billion people, almost half the planet, rely on fish as an important source of protein.
Not much more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions that humans emit into the atmosphere finally emerge in the atmosphere. They're taken up by ecosystems. If we had to pay for that currently free service, we would pay billions of dollars. Ecosystems and biodiversity has a gigantic value for human society.
The UN World Conservation Monitoring Centre, based in Cambridge in the UK, has been studying the ability of the world's ecosystems to soak up and store CO2.
plants do this as a natural part of their biological process. So we don't really have to interfere and do anything with a technological fix. But what we need to do is make sure that we care for these natural systems so that we don't lose them, so that they can stay there, they can be well maintained, and that they can continue doing the kind of job that we need them to do.
The centre has been using satellite imaging to map areas where biosequestration is highest.
And let's have a look at the Amazon in more detail.
Okay. Each tonne of CO2 soaked up prevents $85 of damage, according to Stern. The centre has estimated it costs the equivalent of just $10 per tonne of CO2 to restore soils and degraded land, making natural ecosystems highly cost-effective.
Forests aren't the only ecosystem that matters. Looking at global averages, tropical forests store typically about 160 tonnes per hectare of forest. But looking at peatlands, the global average is nearly 10 times higher at 1,450 tonnes of carbon per hectare.
Peatlands are the most space-effective carbon stores of all ecosystems and are estimated to contain 550 gigatons of CO2, according to the centre. But globally, 65 million hectares of peatland, an area the size of France, is under threat from erosion, cutting or conversion to agricultural land. About a third of all the peatland is in Indonesia. This is peatland forest in the province of East Sumatra. But in February this year, Indonesia lifted a freeze on the use of peatlands for palm oil plantations, putting 2 million hectares at risk. This enormous plantation is in the North Riau province of Sumatra. Ironically, there is now increased demand for the oil as it's used in the production of supposedly eco-friendly biofuel. Once the drained peatland is taken into account, it's estimated that burning palm oil produces 3 to 9 times the amount of CO2 as coal. Peatlands are also found in temperate regions. In the UK, 94% of raised peat bogs have already been lost to acid rain from decades of atmospheric pollution from cities and factories. It kills the mosses and lichens that bind the peat, making them vulnerable to erosion and summer fires.
There's a huge volume of peat that's been lost here, and clearly the vegetation is going to find it very difficult to establish on those steep sides, and also the sort of vegetation we want, because peat bog vegetation needs a high water table. Now clearly the water table's gone because the surface is now down here rather than up here.
Replanting cotton grasses helps bind the soil, erecting barriers to reduce the impact of flash floods, and using biodegradable netting to stabilise gully sides further protects the landscape.
This shows you what a healthy bog might look like. You've got here all of this green sort of moss here, the bog mosses, but crucially you can see here, if I just press there, you can see the water table really near the surface. This is what we're aiming to see, a healthy natural bog, good for wildlife, good for carbon storage and good for water quality as well.
Even in their much reduced state, peatlands are the single largest carbon reserve in the UK. With around 3 billion tonnes, that's more carbon than in the forests of Britain and France combined. With the economies of the world looking to rebuild, protecting the natural environment provides new job opportunities.
We have the climate change crisis with us right now, and we also have an employment crisis. And this biosequestration idea of paying people to manage ecosystems in a climate-friendly way opens up the possibility of new kinds of employment for those people who urgently need it, particularly in developing economies.
The management of natural ecosystems for the goods and services they provide are bound up with the climate negotiations set to take place in Copenhagen in December. However, despite 2 weeks of preparatory talks in Bonn this June, little progress has been made towards even agreeing a negotiating text.
The draft negotiating texts are in some ways a mess. That's not the fault of the chairman, but because the party positions are somehow a mess. The country positions are not coherent and they're not enough. And I think that there has to be a major change in the political level of attention paid to the problem by heads of government.
While delegates argue the details, the sheer scale of the challenge is difficult to grasp. According to Nate Lewis of the Californian Institute of Technology, we will need to build one nuclear reactor every 2 days for the next 40 years if we are going to stand any hope of keeping CO2 below dangerous levels. With the Intergovernmental Panel of Scientists asking for cuts between 25% and 40% of CO2 emissions by 2020, the emerging economies such as India and China have yet to make any commitment to reducing CO2. And of the developed world, Japan is offering 8%, the US 14% and the EU 20%. But will the world agree to what most scientists regard as meaningful cuts by the time of the Copenhagen meeting? The outlook seems bleak.
I give you a prediction that it will not happen, because the global agreement which is required is not politically attainable.
Our work as a world over the last couple of years has created an opportunity. Now, will we take that opportunity? I'm not fully confident, but the opportunity is definitely there. It's now ours to squander.